Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Right now we have 18 attendees. If I may propose, we wait for a couple more minutes for more attendees to come. If we agree, shall we start at 15:10, 10 past 15, 10 past 3 o'clock? Yeah.
That's fine.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is 10 past 3 p.m. now. We will start the webinar today while waiting for other attendees to enter the room. So we are very thankful for your participations in our webinar today. It's about the role of stakeholders in social protection reform in South Africa. And we are lucky that we have Dr. Virginia Peterson. As you can see in the short bio, she has more than 40 years of experience in social protection, social works, social development. But I would like to highlight one particular experience that she has, which is as the CEO of the South African Social Security Agency from 2011 and 2016. Virginia had hands-on experience in reforming South African social security system. She managed to register 20.7 million, re-register 20.7 million people into the system and saving the government of around 3.2 billion rand, or around 4 trillion rupiah. Before we start, I would allow me to inform you of some logistics. As some of you know, maybe this is a series that this webinar is a series, and this is the third one, and we will continue this series every month until July 2022. So every month we will have different topics with different lecturers on social protection that we can discuss. And should you have any questions, please type in the Q&A box. You can type it in Indonesian and we will translate it into English for Virginia, so don't worry. And we also have interpretation services available. If you can click at the bar below, click the interpretation button and you can choose Indonesian or English channel. And for your information, this webinar will be recorded. So without further ado, may I give the floor to Virginia? Please, Virginia.
Thank you so much, Chris. Good afternoon to all the Indonesian social protection practitioners and academics who have tuned in today. I would firstly like to acknowledge this initiative under the leadership of Mr. Pai Saruga. I think it's very important that we acknowledge the role the ILO is playing in promoting social protection and supporting the systems to make sure that everybody is empowered and their capacity is built. I also want to thank my other colleagues who are assisting us today, Ayu, Julia, and Olia for the interpretation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. My presentation looks at the role of stakeholders in the South African context in terms of social protection reform. And if we could just go over to the next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Before I unpack, thank you very much. Before I unpack the stakeholders, I thought it just seemed prudent for me to just unpack and quickly reflect on social protection because it's important that we understand that social protection is the provision of basic services on the one hand, so that's health, nutrition, housing, and counseling. And on the other hand, it looks at social security in the terms of social assistance, social insurance, and of course, labor market interventions. We will see that social protection operates like a safety net to address poverty, vulnerability, and inequality, but it's also what I like to refer to as the insurance policy of the poor, to deal with things like aging, disability, exclusion, reducing the impact of exposure to risk and shocks. Particularly at this time, we are still dealing with the COVID shock and what the role is of social protection in dealing with that. The ILO defines social protection as a set of formal and informal interventions that are aimed at reducing social and economic risk, vulnerabilities, and deprivations of all people, and to facilitate equitable growth. Next slide. So we see that social protection, in fact, has 5 key functions. It is protection, prevention, promotion, transformation, and it is also generative. So it seeks to give us a range of different products in order to reduce social vulnerability of our citizens. Next slide, please. When looking at social security, the important thing here is to see that it's public and private measures to protect individuals, families, and households who are obviously struggling with the loss of income, unemployment, old age, death, disability, because the spousal support and so on, but also those who have injuries due to occupational issues and maternity benefit. Now, if we look at the diagrammatic impression of social security, you will see that we have social security in the last line in terms of 3 pillars is what South Africa operates on. For example, the contributory one would be pillar 3, which speaks to voluntary schemes, where social assistance, which is non-contributory, that is a public sector response to people who have not provided for their social protection. Social insurance is contributory, and in South Africa, we still have a gap that particularly informal workers are not yet protected by social protection as we'd like. In fact, I was saying earlier that we have just submitted a green paper to discuss the establishment of a national social security fund to include informal workers, but this is going to be challenged in the times we are currently living. So there's no mandatory pension system. The other gap for South Africa in social assistance, people between the ages of 18 to 59 are also not protected, although we've made special dispensations now during the COVID time. Labor market interventions, this is also a form of pillar 1, is where we've taken unemployed youth and women and given them training and skills, and also given them temporary occupation. Government's expenditure in social protection in South Africa is referred to as a social wage, as done in many countries. Next page, please. When we look at the South African social protection landscape, you will see Department of Health. This is one of the key departments. We've given free health care to obviously vulnerable families, that's women and children under 6. We were moving towards what's called our national health insurance when COVID struck, and that is obviously somehow overtaken. The reason for doing this is that only 16 million of our 60 million population is in private medical aid. The majority go to public health. The health department also takes care of what's called COIDA, which is compensation for injuries on duty, etc. Then you look at basic education. At our schools, we offer nutritional support for our vulnerable learners. There's also free education in a 4-quintile package for the lowest quintile, where parents are unemployed and families are living in poverty, as well as special education is also provided in public schools for children with disability needs. The Department of Higher Education, we also want children from vulnerable families to be able to attend university or TVET colleges, as we call it. So we have a system of financial aid in our country to support them so that we can raise people out of poverty. In terms of agriculture, and agriculture has taken off quite nicely of late, particularly during this COVID period. Farming subsidies are given particularly to poorer communities, and the labor market intervention in the Department of Agriculture is extension workers that we've brought, particularly because we've had so many job losses over the past 18 months due to COVID, that they are finding space by going back to the rural areas and finding some form of work. Cooperatives, or what we call communal farming, is also very critical in our landscape because of people living in rural areas, and with land distribution post-apartheid, we have given groups of people land to be able to do more than subsistence farming. Department of Labor, very important in our social protection landscape. Provident Fund, particularly for the low-income workers. We have that unemployment insurance fund. Ours is contributory, not exactly as done in some other countries, I think, including yours. We obviously have workmen's compensation and disability and maternity. And for COVID, we brought in a temporary, I stress that, fund to go more than a year to pay people something whilst they are unemployed. Next slide, please. When we look at the Department of Social Development, another key driver, in fact, that is the mother body for SASSA. SASSA was first, the work of SASSA, social assistance, was part of the department. But the reform was to create an agency and set it aside whilst it reports through the different structures. This particular department has also had to respond on a temporary basis to COVID by giving unemployed youth, and particularly women and obviously men as well, but we have a great number of youth in our country, something like $25 per month. It's a small amount, but it makes a difference. And they also support NGOs who give food relief, etc. The Department of Finance is included in this landscape purely because it gives the employees' pension fund resides under that. So when I worked in government, I paid my pension and I retired from this fund, as well as having a private fund, because, you know, government and living conditions in your older years, you do want to be able to live a little bit more comfortably and not stress. Department of Local Government and Traditional Affairs, we do for vulnerable families provide free electricity and free water, although it's limited in terms of the basic needs. Number 9 is the Department of Transport. Now here we use a fuel levy in order to compensate people who have been injured or have died in road accidents. So every road user who puts gas in their car, there's a small percentage that goes into this fund. Public Works, this is the work guarantee program for young people. It's called the Expanded Public Works Program. This is to address the needs of the most vulnerable, particularly youth, where there's a high level of unemployment, and women in these programs where we provide the skills training and placement. Well, you all have private sector. We have a private sector which deals with retirement insurance and annuities, medical aid scheme, and income replacement insurance. Next slide, please. Thank you. The next slide will deal with key reforms. So there we go. Now, you know, in South Africa, we had a situation called apartheid that was very devastating for our communities. Certain people were treated differently because of the color of their skin. So one of the first reforms was to remove all what we call race-based benefits. For example, if you were called, and I have to use race here, a white older person and you were getting social assistance, you would get a full amount every month. If you were a Black older person, you would get half of that every second month. So can you see the inequality that persisted at the time? And with democracy, we obviously had to deal with that. We also had a maintenance grant, and you'll see the maintenance grant was for mothers and children where fathers were not present. They could have been in prison, they could have been deceased. There was only 1 million because it was targeting white communities only. And when we became a democratic country, we introduced a child support grant gradually. First quarter was up to age 6, and then we moved it up to age 14, and finally up to age 18. So we have 12 million children benefiting from the social assistance program. Public health, I said we go into the national health insurance, early childhood development as one of the other elements in social protection. We have introduced a compulsory early childhood development year in schools. So it's not just people who can afford it to send their children to early childhood development. Even the poor have that now because it's compulsory within education. I spoke about the farming provident fund before. Low earning workers, when they retired at 60 or 65, they would take their lump sum. And you know what happened? After 2, 3, 4 years, they had no income. They had to come back for social assistance. So the reform was to annuitize 1/4 you could take as cash, and 2/4 would then remain for monthly payments. The government pension fund has also adopted that strategy, and the difference between the defined pension plans, which is like the public sector, you are guaranteed the replacement value that you said you would invest over time together with your employer. Where in the private sector, because they operate differently on caps, which is defined contribution pension plans, we had to bring some regulation, but sometimes they'll drop to even like 25% replacement because they're related to market forces. There was a range of fragmented benefits before our reforms. And so we had to take on as a country the change to make sure there was a social wage with a minimum package of national products to deal with the issue of having a social protection floor. Our services have been mainly manual for a long time, and we had to move to automation as part of the reforms that we created, but also from single systems to what I call interoperable systems. Now, the important thing about understanding interoperability, I think I might also be going a bit too fast for Aurea. Aurea, I hope you're okay. This is the ability of systems to be mutually benefit to each other. For example, if I tap in an ID number, that's your identification number, the Department of Home Affairs will recognize it immediately, and I would be in no doubt that you are a citizen, for example. If I tap in a child's name in the area, education, because of the MIU agreement I had scored with the Department of Education, would be able to say this child is attending school. So you'll see the importance and significance of interoperable systems. Unemployment vulnerability, and I said we started the work guarantee program for young people. The motor vehicle accident fund had a fault, no fault clause, which we changed when it became the road accident fund. And then also, as I said earlier, special purpose vehicles, that's what the SPV is about. We then developed delivery agencies outside of the departments, and the departments became their mother body. So it would be SASSA, it will be the National Youth Development Agency, it will be the National Development Agency. Next slide, please. In order for reforms to take place, it's very important that we look at in what framework are you going to do your reforms. I think it's very important that there's a very clear, defined framework for changes to take place, because that's what reforms, because that will show you how to involve your stakeholders. So you will see, and we do have courses at the ITC ILO in Turin, where we deal with service quality and good governance, and they will speak of the frameworks that you would need to use. And I think the important thing I was trying to stress here, it's not just having the framework, you should also have change management, because a change management team will help you to achieve the objectives. Stakeholders should be given multiple channels to exercise their voice. Why is that important? This whole thing is about stakeholders, right? Stakeholders can play a role if they consulted in co-design for the reforms, not just be a lag indicator where you ask them to evaluate a program once it's already in place. They can be in right from the beginning. So it's important that boards and management of SSI, Social Security Institution, are listening to their stakeholders with whom they engage. Next slide, please. When we look at the key deliverables of a framework, governance becomes very important. Now, ISA has a good governance guidelines, and my friend Chris has been on one of these courses at the ITC ILO, where we look at governance. And what governance essentially is the manner in which the vested authority uses its powers. So governance of a quality framework involves several factors. You have to identify the objectives and the principles and the framework so that you have good structures. And what are the good structures we're referring to? Boards and management. It's important that your board should reflect, for example, social protection capacity, should reflect finance capacity, should reflect investment, should reflect worker representation, whether it's through trade unions, but workers. That beneficiaries should also form part of your board, because it becomes important that they exercise their voice in shaping future needs of an organization. In terms of looking at your stakeholders, right? So once you've established your objectives, measurements, then you will look at how to map your stakeholders, because it becomes important. And when we look at stakeholders in terms of a definition, as a groups whose actions affect the institution, these may be staff, citizens, businesses, it could be unions, civil society organization, international organizations, all and particularly beneficiaries form part of the stakeholder field. Now, once you've done that, could we have the next slide, please? Your mapping is now done. You need to analyze your stakeholders. Why is this important? Analysis being the first step you should have. Because first of all, the board and management should know who are the stakeholders in the business they are running. That's very important. Because if there's change management, you need to know what is the field of consultation for stakeholders. So you have to identify everyone with a concern or interest who needs to be involved. But when looking at your full list, you also see who is a primary stakeholder and who is a secondary stakeholder, who is the greatest involvement to the peripheral involvement, because that will say how to list them. More important, the stakeholder is to the success of the project. The more important it is to spend time and resources in maintaining their involvement. Next slide, please. Now, once you've completed your analysis, could we go to the positioning of the stakeholders? One slide, there we go. You have now mapped your stakeholders, you know, so now it's important to look at the disposition of the stakeholders. Are they on board? Is there commitment? Are they enrolled? Are they energetic about this change that is about to come back? So there's genuine compliance perhaps of the staff involved in the change, or there's formal compliance, which is a bit stand back and I'll only do what I have to do within my framework. Then you have stakeholders who are grudgingly compliant, you know, I'll just do enough so that they don't sack me, but I'm really not comfortable. You know, we have to deal with these issues because sometimes it's not just apathy of the stakeholders. Sometimes you haven't had creative ways in engaging the stakeholder. Your documents haven't not been clear. You haven't addressed the fears and conflicts. And that is why you, as the leader of a change team in reforms, you'd have to look at that and say, how can I reach out even to people who are apathetic? Next slide, please. Now, in looking at I've already done the looking at the stakeholders from identification and mapping and analysis. I want to go straight into consultation. I think it's very important to consult. Now, in South Africa, our consultation process is first internal consultation, right? So you're looking at, are we able to, do we have the financial resources to go out and say we want to reform? You need to know about few things. Then you have a stakeholder engagement and you hear what are the issues that they would like to see reformed. You will then compile your content and you will have again internal and external consultation. You will go to the social cluster, and I'm going to talk about these mechanisms which you will attend to in order to ventilate your document before it goes to Parliament and Cabinet and NEDLAC. And I've got a whole page on NEDLAC because I'm going to talk about that some more. So it's important to have a process that is well defined for consultation. Now, in terms of the types of stakeholder, you could have the minister, right? Who's, for example, the Minister of Labor or the Minister of Social Development or the Minister of Health. Now, first of all, the minister's role is part of a political party. They have a political mandate, a manifesto. They will look at how your work aligns to that in proposing strategic alignment or reforms. And this will go through the cabinet parliament. Then you would have a social cluster. Now, in the South African context, the social cluster would be these departments I've listed, they would come together through the heads of departments, director generals, or CEOs of agencies, and they will debate elements there. Ministerial, some ministers don't want boards. They prefer ministerial advisory councils to be part of their stakeholder fees to advise them. That is the role. They advise the minister. Then NEDLAC, and I'll talk to it some more, that is one of our greatest reforms in South Africa to promote not just our economy, but also social protection. So I'll talk about that then. Now, if you look at the board and executive management, the board is that group of people who under legislation is responsible for the governance and exercising oversight over the administration of a social protection or social security program. The management's role is to be responsible for the administration and the day-to-day operations of the program or the institution, as well as implementing the resolutions of the board. So you see the roles for those stakeholders there. Now, ESA in its good governance guidelines has about 69 guidelines, and 25 of those guidelines are devoted to the board and management, particularly looking at key areas of governance, financial sustainability, sound investments, looking at members, their contribution and coverage, and resource management. When we look at members and beneficiaries, members of a fund could be the employers and the employees, right? And then the beneficiaries are those who are really drawing. I heard that your unemployment fund will start from March next year, where you will then have beneficiaries, for example. Then it is important to hear what their role is. And their role is to provide information, accurate information to the agencies who support them in social protection, but also to make sure that the service is accessible by raising their voice to say, this is not working for us. We are beneficiaries. We have contributed, or we haven't contributed, but you're still not accessible. Employees and employer representatives in our countries, trade unions play a big role, worker representation. So it's important that we understand how the worker individual, but more importantly, the employees through their representation would like to add their voice to whatever reforms need to happen. The employers also have organization, and under NEDLAC, I will give you more of that. The secondary stakeholders, so this more peripheral, they're not the primary ones. Third-party service contractors, which you would have to get. But an important ones are the banks, for example, in social protection, if you're using the banks, right? There's Visa, MasterCard, if you're having acquiring blanks or switching, because if you're not just using what's called an on-us card, but a debit card, which is a magnetic strip and you can go anywhere, you would have to deal with that. And the thing that you can't see there is international agencies like the ILO. What do they give? What is their role? They provide us with best practice. We engage them to see what is being done across the world and how can we improve. They also from time to time give countries assistance in the same way that Chris is giving you assistance today by giving you this lecture. So the point is, each of these stakeholders have a role to play. It's very important. We have, besides ILO, there's UNICEF, there's International Social Security, there's the UN, there's the EU, with all different functions in supporting. Their roles could be dialogue, it could be capacity building, it could be helping you establish the plan for your reforms. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at what I called a major reform in South Africa with regard to stakeholders. It was developing a representative governance structure, and not just governance in terms of the public sector, but governance generally, accountability, transparency, those kind of things, participation. So we looked at how this was going to be done in our new democratic country, to build the partnership, but also restructuring the elements of the partnership. And what we came up with was the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC. And we have an Act, it's 35 of 1994. And what this looks at is the effective public participation of stakeholders. It also facilitates consensus and cooperation between government, labor, business, and community, right? So you see the 4 partnerships emerging in NEDLAC. So their aim is to receive these proposals after it's gone through a series of consultation through various stakeholder fields. And it comes there, and they look at problem solving, negotiation, and what they would do when they're done with their work. They would then take it to the cabinet and the president and to parliament. And that is the stamp of approval that stakeholders have been involved. Now, there are 4 chambers in the NEDLAC, right? And it operates under the Department of Labor. So it is labor market, public finance and monetary policy, development, and trade and industry. Now, their representation, right, is out of 4 quarters. It is from government, so you'll see there's a parliament, the cabinet, social cluster. These people can be represented on the NEDLAC conversation. Some of them come in just to present their work and leave, and there are some permanent representatives. Then you have trade unions, which is worker representation. Now, these stakeholders are represented through trade union federations, and our key trade union federations are COSATU, FEDUSA, NACTU, these acronyms, and you can look them up. You can go into the South African webpage and find them, but they are large unions, so they have a voice on behalf of the workers. Then organized business, because there has to be a place where business also can contribute as a stakeholder to the development of where our country is going to. And lastly, civil society. Now, we have a very vibrant civil society culture in our country. So you will have organizations who are proactive advocates on behalf of poor communities. Treatment Action Campaign, when we had AIDS at its highest peak in our country many years ago, right? This NGO came into being. You have NGO coalitions where smaller ones come together, and you'll see they're looking to try and achieve justice for people, but also bring issues onto the table. We also have international organizations who can come and do presentations at the request of NEDLAC as a stakeholder in these stakeholder forums. But for our country, this was one of the most significant restructuring tools, because it recognized that stakeholders have a role in the change process within a country. Next slide, please. Now, I'm very quickly, because we started late, but I think I might have, if I'm about 10 minutes, hopefully, but I'm sure they'll advise. I do? Great, thank you, Chris. South African Social Security Agency, SASSA. Now, I was very fortunate. I always say social protection is a calling. It was never just a job. Because if you find yourself in a situation where you're working with the most vulnerable, the most poor in your society, and you're able to make a difference, and you have to work extremely hard at doing that. So this fact sheet just says there was more than 8,000 staff at SASSA. There was something like 445 offices and service points. Let me explain to you what a service point is, where you go into a community and you only serve for 2 days a week. It's not a 5-day operation. The 389 local offices, that's a 5-day operation. We also had mobile trucks, because in some of our areas, they're very small, rural, and they can't afford a full office, but they can afford to be serviced in one way in order to make your service accessible. We also had contracted pay points where people could receive their money, a professionalized call center. And if you look at, more than 500 million rand was spent on administration, and the volume of beneficiaries is 17.8 million. It's down from what it was, and I'll explain to you that happened as a result of a re-registration process. The bulk of them are 12 million children, but 11 million adults collect on behalf of the children and behalf of the aged, etc. So 32% of the population is benefiting from this non-contributory program, Pillar 1 of Social Security. And their payment methods is obviously they banked, and some of them collect their money through payments using their cards. Next slide, please. Just to say that SASSA is a recognized public entity. The act was, we enacted in 2004, and it only started in 2006. And it is the sole agent to ensure the efficient and effective management and administration and payment of social assistance. So it's separated from the Department of Social Development, where it was involved in doing business there, and it became a separate agency. And obviously, it had a range of different operations besides giving grants and benefits, but also looking at school uniforms, blankets, and particularly when people were in crisis, if houses burned down, you would provide whatever you could. Next slide, please. That's just to give you the number, the 17.8 million, the number in brackets is the amount. I would say 1,780 is about $120 per month. And if you look at 430, that would be about $30 per month. It's not a lot, but to vulnerable communities, it makes the difference. It is something that changes their lives. If they do not have it, we would be in dire poverty. So we're trying to graduate our people, not just through social assistance, but we'd also like to have employment so their children can graduate out of poverty. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at methods of mobilization, this is just, when I came in, SASSA was not that well known. So I had to look at how to make our service accessible, but also change the way that people look at us. Because, you know, people sometimes look at social protection and they look down on social protection. But yet, in the current economies where we also were quite a family-centered country, where your family, if you were in need, you would go to your family. After a while, families could not support their extended family, and you need to be accessible. So we used well-known personalities, we conducted research. This is all to get to the stakeholder voices, right? We had community meetings where we reached out. We didn't just sit in our offices. And we obviously use radio and TV, and the bullet that's fallen off there is social media, because we've also used the Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at how to talk about reforms, as the CEO, I had a 5-year contract, and when I arrived at SASSA, I thought, wow, I hear so many things and all not good. People aren't happy with the service. It takes too long to get a payment. Office space is not available. You know, the offices look like a graveyard of government with broken furniture and piles of files on the floor. So we'd have to change things around here. So what I did, I went out to consult. I went out into our provinces. We have 9 provinces. I went to look at what's the worst pay point, the best pay point, spoke to beneficiaries, spoke to NGOs, spoke to other government departments. So part of the consultation in order to hear their views on this process, the operation cycle of Social Security within SASSA. And, you know, we start with targeting and registration. At that time, we were almost 20 million on the system, right? More than 20 million, in fact. And we had to look at, and a lot of accusation was coming from the Treasury to say, there's fraud in that system. So we had to look at what are we going to do about these things? And I will tell you how we dealt with that. Then if you look at enrollment is the actual applications process of how you get your forms completed, how you get onto the MIS, the Management Information System, and how you get your card that is generated for payment. Now, I put in contribution collection because we sometimes also assisted other departments in their work because we wanted to move towards a comprehensive social security agency, and they would have contribution, which the social assistance program does not have, but some of the other programs we were assisting. Then the payment to recipients. Is it just through a bank? Is there a smart card? Is it mobile money? That's what you would have there. Every organization has to do performance monitoring and evaluation, right? You have to be reflective in order to be predictive, to go into the future and say, I've reflected on what we've delivered over the past 5 years. In order to reform, this is how we're going to go forward. And then you have to look at complaints. Do you have the appropriate complaints mechanisms? For example, can people actually come to you and complain that there's something wrong with their money? What are you using? Call centers, inquiry desk at your offices, online complaints, and is it automated, your complaints division? For stakeholder success, public communications outreach is very important. And as I said before, you use radio, television, social networks to achieve that. And finally, there you'll see you have to give grievances. Now, some people are excluded from a product, for example. On what basis? And do you have mechanisms? Before I went to SASSA, I was the head of the appeals tribunal in my country. So people would appeal to the minister, and then that was under the ministry. I would have to look at it. When I got there, there was like 60,000 backlog applications, and it took me a year to clear the backlog and get on with the new cases because I worked with stakeholders and I had a plan. It's very important to have a well-defined plan. And on continuing improvement, ongoing changes need to be made because what you have today might not be feasible. Lots of people got caught off guard with COVID. They thought their system of delivery of social protection was perfect. Then COVID came, we couldn't see people, and they had to quickly go online. So you have to keep abreast of the time. Next slide, please. So if we go to the next slide, we will see things, the kind of improvement plan I introduced. The first one was consultation and with stakeholders and obviously communication. We've talked a lot about that. Disability targeting. I went to special schools. So I reached out to stakeholders. I went to advocacy agencies, NGOs, and said, this is the care dependent grant and the disability grant is for how can we improve our numbers? I know there's an other. So you see how we went and reached out to stakeholders and they had a role to play in saying, oh, I've noticed this child's in the school and he's not on your system. So you see how stakeholders can move you forward. Also with disability, it was purely a medical definition that was used in SASSA for a long time. And then I sat down with the stakeholders again, the NGOs in this instance, and said, what is the problem here? And there were some people excluded because they did not take into account the social conditions. If you are paraplegic, for example, and you're wheelchair bound, but you live in a neighborhood and you live in an area where there are jobs and you can be retrained, you would be able to earn an income for yourself, right? But if you live in a rural area or an informal area, right, where there aren't even tarred roads, you can't even get out of there. There's no public transport. You would need to be able to apply for assistance from the government. And so the social means in the means testing process gave more people access to extend coverage. Registration, right, which is the next process there. Re-registration, and Chris had mentioned this. Because of accusation of fraud and theft and duplicate payments, I went in and said, I know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to biometrically enroll everyone, and then we're going to see the matching process. And we took off more than 900,000 beneficiaries of the system. And in the next year, because we ran it over 18 months, so in the first year, we already saved 2 million rand. And then we had another process to finalize it. So a re-registration, an SSI will only do re-registration, say, every 10 years. It's not something you do annually, but it was a very good exercise to say we cannot truly defend the beneficiaries on our system. It becomes important. Also, the way we approach offices. Sometimes we just sat in our office and waited for people to come to us. When you reach out to stakeholders, you increase your coverage. So we use the survey outreach approach to do that. And that, in fact, grew our Social Security. And in fact, right now, they're going to start hitting almost 20 million again. So it took them a time because of so many people should not. And then all the people who were chancing their luck also came off the system and reduced it to what it was. Could we have the next slide, please? Chris, how much time do I have? Chris?
5 minutes will be okay.
Yeah, cool.
All
I
right.
can speak very fast. I'll do it. Now,
All right.
enrollment. Now, enrollment is the application process. When I arrived at SASSA, they had one application form was 21 pages long. Another application form was 14 pages long. And I said, what do you need? No wonder you have a file graveyard. That's a batch of files stacked upon each other. Let's look at this application form. The form they use today is 2.5 pages, right? How did I achieve this? Because of interoperable systems and autofill through automated application forms, we were able to reduce all that unnecessary information because you could immediately track, for example, child's at school, you are a citizen. Oh, you're on the tax. You pay tax, and why are you here? Because if you're paying tax, you should be in a contributory system, in a non-contributory system. Can you see how interoperable systems help? For disability, could have immediate access with the health department because your systems could speak to each other. That's what interoperability did, but it also gave us space to reduce our applications process. SASSA, government structure, always looked a bit not like a great place to go and wait in for your service to be rendered. So I also decided after my consultation with staff and beneficiaries to revamp the offices, and attached you will see a grid to see how we did them year on year. Staff training. Lots of countries do not have a formal program for social protection. Many universities don't cover social protection adequately. So I had to introduce a training package and also link ourselves to the ESA training in order to get our staff and raise the grade level of staff to a higher level because they've achieved some form of training specifically related to social security or social protection. 4-step model application. It was 7 steps before. I reduced it because of all the kind of innovations. We also use expanded public work because we didn't have enough staff to help us with the re-registration product. So we use unemployed women and youth in that program to assist us. Automation. You must know what you want to automate before you go and incur a very costly exercise, because automation can be extremely expensive. For example, your MIS, a replacement of that, can cost millions of dollars. You need to understand. So a very clear understanding of what you want to do. Then the payment method. People could only go to a pay point, and a small percentage at that time was receiving their money in the bank. What I converted was you can have a card, which is just what I call an on-us card, where you can only go to that place and you can't do any other transactions. So I went for a biometrically linked smart card, which is a debit card, but also negotiated with the banks for what you call a limited bank account with no bank charges. And that would say you could have 4 withdrawals and 4 statements, but you can't do more than that, and then there will be no bank charges. Okay. And we also extended options, because if you have a debit card, it's like everybody else. For once, the poor could be like everybody else. Women, in fact, came to me and said, I feel so liberated. I don't have to ask my husband for money. I can take my card and I can go to the shop and I can go and get money out of my card. So it liberated women in our communities as well. Automation, qualified audits, this is governance. A very important part of governance, you have actuaries in terms of investment, but in terms of auditors and internal audit, very important as a governance structure. The board has to oversee that there is an internal audit component, and the management must see that it's well functioned. At the end of the day, the internal audit component will report to the board, but you'll also have external auditors. We were a government who would come in. And for the time I was there, we did not have a single qualified audit, which was great. Grievance processes, I said that is important. You need to have an internal and an external grievance process so that people can access you to complain, say they were paid short, or why does it take so long to get their money? And it's important, but there should also be a formal process like an appeals tribunal where things really can crystallize, where people can be charged if they're not doing the right thing. Now, the 2 slides I've added was just to show you the trajectory of change. So I'm just going to ask, next slide. I'm just going to go on to the next one. So you'll see go back to the one before, sorry, just stay there. You will see that things in green means that we achieve them. Things in yellow meant that they were in progress, and things in red meant that it was ongoing. Now, the 2 issues in red, ongoing enrollment and the biometric for staff, that happened as I was leaving. So those were the last of the things I achieved, and I handed that over, because you must have a career path and you must have succession planning. Although the minister did not take the person I proposed, she took someone else and the person lasted for 3 months. Like, tough job. Next slide, please. I'm almost done, just a minute. So the structured support your change, because if you want to have stakeholders, you have to know you need to have a projects officer and a project manager, right? And a team. Identification of the stakeholders. You need to know how to circulate your documents so that you can get feedback, right? And then you have to have regular engagement. So during my time, I would have key engagements depending on the primary nature of the stakeholder. That would be quarterly. For example, you go quarterly to Parliament and you'll present your monitoring and evaluation plan on how you've done. And then there would be other stakeholders you will see every 6 months and report on programs, and others you would see annually. These are things that you will decide with your business units on how to proceed on a service quality improvement plan when you do plan that for your organization. Just lastly, reporting. Reporting is very important. Last slide there. Reporting, yeah, very important. And I've given you a process. I've added the slide on South Africa's COVID response because people in this time, could we move to my last slide, please? People at this time, South Africans, there we go. We obviously, like many countries, had issues with PPE, protective clothing, sanitizers, vaccines. So the presidency took responsibility for that. Now, in terms of social protection, which became the savior for everybody during COVID times, the temporary employment relief scheme was under the Department of Labor. So they gave people, so even if you were unemployed for more than a year, they would then support you for longer. And they've just through NEDLAC agreed to extend that again by 6 months. You will see the health, obviously, had to make sure that we could have testing everywhere. And then if you look at Social Security, SASSA, they introduce a carer, because remember, we're giving a child support grant for a child. We introduced during the COVID time, it was over a period of initially 6 months, and it's been renewed for another 6 months. So it was October. They've just decided that can happen until February, because it was a huge outcry from communities. But also we gave a COVID SRD grant for the unemployed. 350, not a lot of money, but it made the difference. Now that was very quick. So now we can go over to questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Very, very fruitful information, very comprehensive information. If I may summarize, I think the 4 most important steps or things that you've done during the reformation is, first, you involve all the stakeholders through the establishment of NEDLAC That's why from there you listen to everyone, and everyone involved in there in the decision making. And the second one is you use in information technology and automation to simplify the process, to make it simple, but also you do outreach very well to the remote areas. You provide trucks services, for example, so people even the most remote area can access the services. And after that, you train your staff, to enhance their capacities. And the last one, then you establish, you implement good governance principles and practices. I think that's if I may summarize what what the cause or what have made you bring you the success of reforming the social security system in South Africa. So there are a number of questions that we received, but first of all, if I may ask, is where is the NEDLAC seats in the consultative and policy making bodies? What is the consultation mechanism? Because as we can see, the parliament is also there, represented there, the government is also there, but how is it relate to like the parliament, for example, and the executive decision making process? And
I can tell you, Chris. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there another like a tripartite bodies focus specifically on labor issues, or is it only in NATLAC?
Okay. Let me say to you that our president will not move on anything a department has sent unless NEDLAC has brokered it, discussed it. There's an act, it's enacted by government, right? So NEDLAC sits in Pretoria. Obviously, it has its offices, but it also has its institutions in the 9 provinces. So it's decentralized so that it can be more accessible. So the representatives, the process of NEDLAC is, for example, in the trade union, because I have worked in a trade union as well many years ago. That was before NEDLAC, but we belong when COSATU was started, which is one of our largest democratic unions, for example. We didn't have that formal arrangement where someone could actually influence and broker. So as a trade union, in your trade union, you would have your council meetings, right? In your departments, you would have your council meetings. You would have consultation. You would come up with new plans. You will take it for the first look through your minister. You will go and discuss it at Parliament. Then it will go back. Cabinet will say, has it been to NEDLAC? Has it been to NEDLAC? It will not go beyond your dream unless it's been to NEDLAC. So you see the emphasis on stakeholder formalization that is put on them. So it is that's why I say it's one of the most significant reforms for South Africa, NEDLAC, because it guarantees stakeholders will have a role. Okay, does that help you?
Great. Thank you very much. So very, very important agency or council, for the decision making, and it's involved all the stakeholders. Very interesting. Even the parliament or the government won't do and won't take any decision if it's not approved by NEDLAC, for example. Okay, great. Now there is another question: how social protection is provided for the non-wage workers in South Africa? Because in Indonesia, this group tends to be neglected.
Yeah. Now, that's exactly what I was discussing. What we call the informal, for example, the last low-wage worker that we introduced was the domestic workers. And if you say non-wage, is a comparative to what? You have informal, where people work as informal people in the street selling things. So they would have, today they'll work, tomorrow they won't work. Are we talking about that group? Because that's informal employment. South Africa was challenged tremendously during COVID with exactly that, not having enough data. But what we did, we made the COVID-19 grant available. Very little, 350. to give them social protection. But that is only until February. And I can already see the outcry when it gets to February, because it already stopped in this year. It was up until February this year. Then there was a huge outcry. COVID didn't go away. We finally got the vaccines. People were losing jobs. People couldn't make jobs. People in the tourism sector, etc., could not have any income. And that is why we gave them this. I think this will be the genesis of what's called the basic income grant, possibly in my country. Because come February, when you take that away, there will be a huge outcry. Our country is poor, very poor. Our unemployment today stands at more than 30%. And the bulk of the unemployed are young people. So it will result in a huge outcry. So the social assistance pillar would have to be reconsidered for a more permanent solution than it is at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. The next question, I think relates to that. There's a question from, hold on, let me check the name. Dimas Surya. How did was there any issues in identifying social assistance beneficiaries? How did you manage to get it right? You know, to get the assistance to the right person that is needed,
You know, if you look at targeting, how you do targeting, usually you say, is it a means-tested grant? Is it specifically for a particular group? Right. That's where you start. What are you trying to achieve? Now, we found that accessibility is what leads to coverage. If you don't have an office near poor people, then you're not accessible. If you don't have information, I even use the schools, right? I would go to special schools with children with disabilities and speak to them. I would let the staff go. And this became part of our way of dealing with them to further identify it. I would speak to the chiefs, because, you know, we are quite tribal in South Africa. We have lots of tribes, you know. So you go to the chief and say, are you part of the targeting mechanism for me? Are there poor people that you know, and why haven't they come forward? Is it documentation? As we automated, documents also improved, right? So we could extend our service. So it's quite a range of different activities in order to reach people. But it does mean making yourself more accessible, not just physically, also now through social media. So people can see, you know, during a television program that I knew lots of people watch, I would flag the strip at the bottom. If you want to know about SASA, please just contact, we will call you back. Just send us a text. So once people are informed, they will come forward.
Okay. Okay. I think you answered these questions earlier about elderly and disabled person. It's interesting that in addition to just to do a means test, that I think your key element or component is activity is the reach out. You reach out to your constituents, to the people, you know. I think that's very interesting to learn. And there's another question from Ms. Virgie. In your experience, what is the most effective way to raise awareness on social protection? I think you've mentioned this. I think this might be also relates to the Mokondo community outreach program.
Mokonzo.
I don't know. Yeah, Mokonzo. Yeah, please.
Before, staff used to sit in their offices. They used to sit. They didn't like me at all. I can tell you the staff were not happy when I came there, because they just sat in their offices. And I said, hello, what's happening here? Do you know there are people out there that don't know you exist? So we're going to go out. We're going to make a map. So even the minister started going out with us on Mikonzo, right? It's an outreach. So we will go, and in the end, we were taking health with us, home affairs with us, other departments we needed for documentation so that people could get access. So the point is, it's using a wide range of different strategies, right? But also effective. I would go into the schools, a little note at the schools for children to take to what we call a grandmother is a gogo in my culture, gogo. Now, Gogo doesn't read, right? We're poor people, farm people, vulnerable people. Gogo doesn't read. Gogo doesn't know they can come to you. But if you give it to the child at school, they will go and they will read to Gogo. Gogo, you're going to turn 60. You can go and make an application for your pension from the government. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Putting it on TV. Our people listen to radio more than TV. It's more affordable. So I would regularly have staff go and speak in the 12, because we have sign language as our 12th language. We have 11 spoken languages and one language for people with disabilities. Regularly go and speak on radio so that we can advocate, this is your right. The government gives this to you. We as a department, as an agency, cannot deny you your right. But that's why I said social protection for me was a calling, not just a job. And that's why I pushed so hard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Virginia. There's another question. Who is in the stakeholders, in your experience, that needs most effort to get involved with in the decision-making process? This is a question from Astrid from the Ministry of Manpower.
Astrid, it's usually business. Unions are always chomping at the bit. They first there, they're putting the worker representation, even the civil society is there. But business, because they always see as it's going to be money that they would have to also afford to be in the process. But because we now have coalitions for business, it's not individual, we have a better response. We had to look at it, we had to analyze the problem and deal with it. In terms of non-contributory, there are always people who live on the margin, the homeless. You always have to reach out to the homeless more than other communities. So you have to find a way in reaching them. So the homeless, in terms of social assistance, always been a problem. And in terms of NEDLAC, it was always, business was always the stickiest. The unions were pushing and business were pushing hard against. But that's normal. That's our life, right? Because at the end of the day, we will move forward because the president will say, this has been at NEDLAC for a year. What's happening? The people are waiting. And you know, politicians want to stay another 5 years. So it's important that these structures work. But business and homeless people, those were the challenging ones. And informal sector workers as well.
Okay, so in times when they you know, like workers and employers are not agreeing on one issue, the government usually comes in and make decision. Was that the case?
No, really. No. Government gets the most pushback. In fact, the current Minister of Social Development is getting the most pushback. No. One thing about NEDLAC, they will call in experts from outside, right? Academics. They will come and present. We'll call the ILO, and we have to come and present a report. So we can hear all the voices beyond, so that NEDLAC can make an informed decision to send to the president.
Yes. So it's an evidence-based decision making. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Another question that I would like to ask you is about the internal and external audits. Can you elaborate more on the internal audits? What was the process? Who were involved? They report to the board, right? But where are they sit? You know, in the structure of the agency.
When I arrived, there were like 2 people called internal audit, and there were 2 people called the fraud unit. And I said, what is this? I mean, you know, we didn't have I must make the distinction, we didn't have a board, but I advocated a ministerial advisory council for SASA to the minister. So we had to strengthen the audit capacity. In fact, what I did, I had what's called, before lockdown was fashionable, I would send the audit team into an office and I said, go and check through their processes, right? Check their processes. Who's getting it? Who's not getting it? How's the money? How's the contracting? How, you know, all of those things. How's that happening? And if you find there is more than 30% error rate, lock down the office. Call me, I will lock down the office, and then we take that office apart and we reconstruct. So I was like very evil, right? So that was internal audit. External audit was the capacity we brought on board because we didn't have enough permanent players, right? So we brought in external audit to buffer, but also to give us another voice. So remember, it's the same with looking at your other external audit who does your audit reports. Government also has a national audit body, the Auditor General South Africa. They can specifically an internal audit reports to the board. They look at our processes. They look at the risk charter of the organization where you are vulnerable, and you then have to fix those risks. And then the external auditor who reports to Parliament about you will say, no, they're not doing well. Hey, they're going to have to do better. So those are the role players. It's the same with fraud. We had a very small fraud unit, and yet there was such a great accusation of fraud. So we had to raise the level of engagement, get people to do investigations in our organization, so that when we pass on cases to the police, to justice, that they would be charged. And after we did that bolstering, we got the first case. A person got 14 years as a sentence. It was the highest someone had ever got for fraud. But that was after someone was killed at their desk. It's called syndicate fraud. So you see the things that galvanize these actions.
Wow. Okay. Actually, you touched also the maybe it's also part of the grievance mechanism, the grievance handling mechanism. You mentioned that it's a formal process, right? So you can go to court. Is it a normal civil court, or is it a special like a labor court, or?
Obviously we have different levels of our court. You wouldn't be able to go. You go to the lowest court, if you know it's called the magistrate's court, to log your. You wouldn't be able to go to the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court with the matter. But the point is, with our appeals tribunal, we were able to identify fraud. We were able to identify training needs of staff who were not able to do the calculations correctly. You know that some employees, for example, with the unemployment insurance or provident fund, they would pay under the amount. And you need people, because then people retire or they leave and they say, but I went and I couldn't get my money. Then you go into the records, you see they have not been paying over the money, right? So you need to have that capacity in order to go. In fact, all those people now owe the government, because there were lots of people not paying over the employer contribution or using the employee's contribution and not paying that all over for the UIF in our country. And those grievances have to be sorted out. There is an act for the grievance mechanism, the appeals tribunal, it's in the act, as well as an inspectorate is in the act.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Virginia. Okay. Shall I give the floor to the participants who want to, convey the questions directly? You can say it in Indonesian, and Aulia will help in translating it into English for Virginia. You may raise your hand, and then I think our colleagues will help you with the microphone. If there's any question from the audience, please. Just raise your hand.
Oh, you give me the sense that I answered all your questions ahead of being asked.
Yes. All right. I don't see any hands raised. So, all right then. I guess that's it, Virginia. I think we comes to the end of our webinar today.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Virginia, for the knowledge that you shared with us, your experience. Mostly it's your experience, because that's why I keep emphasizing that you have a hands-on experience, and I hope I'm sure we learn a lot from you for that on that. So I think that's it. Virginia, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
the great sessions. Maybe
Thank
we
you
can see
so
you somewhere.
much. I really appreciate the fact that it was asked, but I also want to say to all the practitioners in social security and social protection, it is challenging environments in which we work, but it is the most gratifying to make a difference in people's lives, in workers' lives. I've worked as a trade unionist, I've worked as a social worker, I've worked as a social security professional and a development specialist. Poor communities, particularly in rural areas, need to be better served. Accessibility is key to your process. So thank you so much for listening. And thank you, Chris, and thank you, Mr. Saruga, for having me today. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.